A thin strip of wood hung in the Athenian agora, covered not with poetry or prayer, but with law, scratched rules that smelled of authority rather than wisdom. Long before marble constitutions and democratic speeches, this was how Athens announced something radical: justice would no longer belong to clans, vendettas, or offended families. It would belong to the state. This moment, traditionally dated to around 621 BCE, is associated with one name that has become shorthand for cruelty: Draco, or Drakon. Even today, the word draconian survives as an insult, a synonym for excessive punishment. Yet to reduce the draconian constitution to its notorious death penalties is to miss its deeper historical meaning. Beneath the severity lay an institutional innovation that quietly reshaped Western political life: the birth of public prosecution, the idea that crimes are offenses against the community, not merely against individuals. This was not just harsh lawmaking. It was a conceptual revolution. Blood feuds and private justice before Draco. Before Draco, Athens was governed less by written law than by custom, memory, and power. Justice operated through oikos, the household, and genos, the clan. If a man was killed, it was the responsibility, and the right, of his family to avenge him. Honor demanded retaliation. Reconciliation, when it happened, was negotiated privately, often with compensation paid in livestock or land. This system favored the strong. Wealthy families could absorb losses, hire allies, and intimidate rivals. Poor families, lacking protection, often endured injustice in silence. The absence of written law meant that magistrates, usually aristocrats, interpreted tradition as they pleased. Justice was elastic, bending toward status. Athens in the late 7th century BCE was a city under pressure. Population growth, economic inequality, and rising tensions between aristocrats and commoners made old customs unstable. Feuds escalated. Violence became cyclical. What the city needed was not mercy, but predictability. Draco delivered exactly that, at a terrifying price. Writing the law, from memory to monument. Draco's most visible innovation was not the death penalty, it was writing the law down. His code was publicly displayed, reportedly on wooden tablets, axones, or triangular pillars, curbis, so that any citizen could, in theory, know the rules. This act alone was revolutionary. Written law limited the interpretive power of judges and aristocrats. It created a shared reference point. Law became something external, impersonal, and fixed, no longer whispered in noble halls, but exposed to public scrutiny. Aristotle later noted that Draco's laws were remarkable less for their content than for their severity, yet the very act of codification mattered. A harsh rule known in advance can still feel fairer than an arbitrary one imposed after the fact. But Draco went further than codification. He redefined who had the right, and the duty, to prosecute crime. The invention of the state prosecutor. The most overlooked feature of the Draconian constitution is its approach to homicide and serious crime. Draco distinguished between intentional murder, unintentional killing, and justifiable homicide, a surprisingly nuanced legal framework for such an early period. But the true innovation lay in procedure. Under Draco, certain crimes, especially homicide, were no longer treated purely as private matters between families. Instead, they became offenses against the polis. While relatives still played a role, the community now claimed authority over the process. This shift laid the groundwork for what we would later call public prosecution. For the first time, Athens moved toward the idea that crime disrupts civic order, not just personal relationships. Punishment serves the stability of the state. Justice must be administered through institutions, not revenge. Even when a victim's family chose not to pursue vengeance, the city could still intervene. The logic was chilling but clear: unchecked violence threatens everyone. In my view, this is where Draco deserves historical credit. He replaced emotional justice with structural justice, even if the structure was brutal. Why so many death penalties? Ancient sources claim that Draco prescribed death for offenses as minor as stealing vegetables. Whether this is exaggerated or not, and it likely is, the perception of universal capital punishment stuck. According to later tradition, when asked why his laws were so harsh, Draco supposedly replied that minor crimes deserved death, and he had no harsher punishment for major ones. This sounds absurd to modern ears, but it reveals an early logic of deterrence. In a society without prisons, police forces, or rehabilitation systems, punishment had to be immediate, visible, and final. Severity compensated for weak enforcement mechanisms. I would argue that Draco was less sadistic than pessimistic. He did not believe society could be morally educated, only restrained. Equality through terror. Paradoxically, the Draconian constitution introduced a crude form of legal equality. The same penalty applied regardless of social status. Aristocrats could no longer escape consequences through influence alone, at least in theory. This equality was negative rather than humane. Everyone stood equally beneath the sword. Yet this mattered. It accustomed Athenians to the idea that law, not lineage, was the supreme authority. Later democratic reforms would soften the punishments but preserve the principle. In this sense, Draco prepared the ground for Solon, even though Solon famously repealed most of Draco's laws, keeping only those related to homicide. The scaffolding remained, even after the cruelty was dismantled. From revenge to procedure. Another subtle transformation under Draco was the replacement of spontaneous retaliation with formal legal procedure. Trials, courts, and specified jurisdictions emerged. Certain courts dealt with specific types of homicide. Ritual purity, exile, and civic responsibility became intertwined with law. Justice slowed down. It became bureaucratic. This is rarely romanticized, but it is foundational. A slow, procedural justice system is often frustrating, but it prevents societies from tearing themselves apart. Modern prosecutors, indictments, and criminal courts can trace their ancestry back to this moment when Athens decided that violence must be monopolized by the state. Was Draco a villain? History has not been kind to Draco. His name survives as a warning, not a tribute. Yet judging him by modern moral standards misses the point. He did not invent cruelty, he attempted to control it. In my opinion, Draco represents a grim truth about state formation: the first laws are rarely gentle. Order is often born through fear before it matures into consent. The Draconian constitution was not a failure, it was an early draft of something better. Without Draco, Solon's reforms might not have been possible. Without public prosecution, democracy itself would struggle to function. Rights require institutions, and institutions require enforcement. Draco gave Athens enforcement, cold, unforgiving, but effective. Legacy: the state claims justice. The most enduring legacy of the Draconian constitution is the idea that justice belongs to the state. Once that claim is made, everything changes. Crimes become public matters. Law becomes abstract and general. Punishment becomes symbolic as well as practical. Even today, when prosecutors act in the name of the people, they echo a decision made in archaic Athens. We no longer execute thieves, but we still accept that crime offends society itself. Draco's laws were erased from the tablets, but not from political memory.